Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name's Julie McCrossin, and my background is as a radio broadcaster with the ABC, and now I earn my living full-time facilitating discussions at events and conferences. I just want to quickly say to the Vice-Chancellor, don't worry about those people that you see everywhere at the same meetings, because my understanding of the research is not only are they happier now, they're going to live longer. Am I right? And so it's an example of the critical role of research. Those of us who go to too many meetings and who are at risk of meeting psychosis because of good quality research have that inner satisfaction of knowing we're going to live a long time. And I'm personally thrilled to be part of a conference focused on research, because when I worked for the last 5 years of my work was on a show called Life Matters on ABC Radio National, job sharing initially with a Catholic lass called Geraldine Doog, and then a Protestant alone for a couple of years. But all the interviews on that program were about the sorts of issues that we'll be talking about today, about improving society with a huge focus on the non-government sector, or the not-for-profit sector. So it's thrilling to be here. What I'm going to do is introduce my panel, and then away we go. And what we're fundamentally looking at is a sort of vision, strategy, action look at civil society, or the third sector, as we move towards 2020. So we're going to talk about what do we mean by civil society in the third sector. We're imagining a Year 12 student, the leader of tomorrow, who's up the back of this conference, and everything we say is going to be comprehensible to that young student, because we want to attract and keep them in our world. We're going to talk about some of the past achievements of civil society and what lessons we can learn from those achievements to guide our future in this sector. We're going to look particularly at the role of research and how it can contribute to civil society. And we're going to look at this question of, do we need a unified identity, a public voice that's readily accessible? Is that required? Or is it okay to come together in small groups for specific purposes for limited periods of time? And we'll hear some diverse views on that. And finally, we'll have some visions for the future. What is our dream vision for 2020? But also, what are our immediate challenges in the next year or so in the light of a big report from the Productivity Commission and also a national compact with this current, slightly rocky, but our current federal government. So that's the sort of territory we're going to cross. So let me introduce our people slightly more fully. If you could just wave when I mention your name. Amanda is eating. We want her to eat. She's breastfeeding, ladies and gentlemen. Amanda Tassel is Deputy Assistant Secretary of Unions New South Wales. She joined the Labor Council, as it then was, in 2002, and she's very active, especially in the areas of workers from non-English speaking background and cultural diversity. She's a community campaigner. She's been active for workers with a disability in the peace movement, with refugees, a former tutor in politics, also a former policy officer with the former president of the Legislative Council here in New South Wales, Meredith Bergman. But right now, in her most recent 3 years, she's been passionate about something called the Sydney Alliance, and we'll hear about that in a moment. And she's an honours graduate in arts and law from this university. So please welcome Amanda. David Thompson, do you want to wave, David? Thank you. David is, Thompson AM is the CEO of Jobs Australia, which is a national peak organisation for 270 non-profit providers of employment and related services. He's also the chair of the National Roundtable of Non-Profit Organisations, a director of the Australian Council of Social Service, a peak national body for civil society, the chair of the Jobs Australia Foundation, the chair of Community 21. I could go on. This is a man who's currently happy and will live a very long time because of his activism. Please welcome David Thompson. I'd now like to welcome the Reverend Eleni Poulos. I have a tendency to call her Eleni, and if I say that, scream, because I have to give her $20 for the charity of her choice every time I get her name wrong. The correct pronunciation is Reverend Eleni Poulos, and she's National Director of Uniting Justice Australia with the Uniting Church. Her Uniting Justice Australia is a justice unit of the Church's National Assembly, and it engages in advocacy, education and lobbying. She's a Minister of Religion, and chair of Act for Peace, the international aid and development agency of the National Council of Churches. She's also a member of the World Council of Churches advisory group, the Commission of the Churches on Internal Affairs. She's a doctoral student currently at the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney, so she cares about research. Would you please welcome Eleni Poulos? I'm just jumping back to Amanda for a moment because I forgot to mention that she's written a book called Power in Coalition. It's available out the back for $35, so it's relevant to the topic at hand. I'd now like to welcome Allison Peters, if Alison wouldn't mind waving. Alison is the Director of the Council of Social Service of New South Wales, or NCOSS as it's often called. Prior to NCOSS, she's held many positions in trade unions, including Deputy Assistant Secretary of Unions New South Wales. She's a current board member of PIAC, the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, a national community legal centre that does a lot of advocacy and individual cases. And she's also a board member of Catalyst Australia, a think tank set up by progressive unions and other organisations. She's held many positions in public and private sector councils and boards, and she has a degree in commerce and law. Please welcome Allison Peters. And Jon Fitzgerald, OAM, welcome to you, sir. He's just stepped down as Director of Development with Surf Lifesaving Australia after 8 years in that role. All his work with Surf Lifesaving Australia is voluntary, happy, living a long time. Look at him, he looks great. Okay, do you mind standing up, sir? This is a man with a solid core. If you don't know what I mean, get help. Are you ready?
Ready. Oh.
He agreed to do that because I'm impressed by a man with a core. But you reckon you don't want to say you've got to be fit as a fiddle to be with Surf Lifesaving?
Absolutely. Our young people say to us, we're not that. We're not bronze Aussies, buff and fit. We're all shapes, sizes, and people from all walks of life. And if you call us, expect us to swim and be buff, sorry, you'll lose us.
Having said that, I reckon he looks pretty good, and I can assure you his core is as solid as a rock. As you can see, I'm a professional. Handling your paper is a very important technique. How do you think I'm going so far? Just coming back to a little bit more about Jon Fitzgerald. His home club is West Beach in Adelaide, and he's kindly flown from Adelaide just for this today, and he's going back this evening. He's also former president of Surf Lifesaving South Australia, and he's the current chair of the Research Advisory Committee with Surf Lifesaving Australia. And he himself is currently conducting research for a Doctorate of Education. So everyone's research mad on this panel. Would you please welcome Jon Fitzgerald? And just finally, right up the other end, if you don't mind waving, is David Crosby, who's the CEO of Community Council for Australia, which is driving reform in the way governments, not-for-profits and the community relate. He's immediate past head of the Mental Health Council of Australia, and in fact David has only been in his current job, it's up there on the wall, isn't it, for 5 days, which means he's had this job 1 day longer than the baby's been alive. I don't know why, but I find that compelling. He's the former CEO of a number of national peak bodies in the mental health and alcohol and other drugs area, and the former CEO of Odyssey House Victoria. He's currently a member of 7 national advisory boards, and he's a director on the board of the Alcohol Education and Rehabilitation Foundation. So please welcome David Crosby. I don't normally do those big intros because it's so hard to remember them, but I did it today because I think it gives you a really clear picture that these are people deeply engaged in our community in a range of ways, and in a way that's what it's all about. Now look guys, I'm a great believer, if you want people to come to meetings you've got to make it fun so they come again, so we increase the volunteer base. Therefore, this is your first task. I'm going to get each of them in a random order to give me a definition of civil society or the third sector, what this conference is all about, and why it's important. You are then going to vote through the clap-o-meter. I say a name, you clap, and whether it goes up or down, right? And the winner, who gets the most claps for their definition, gets a bottle of red wine. What do you reckon? It's called an incentive payment. Sir, would you pick... What? You get the wine, they judge who gets the wine. If you reach under your chair, there is a microphone. David Crosbie, CEO of the Community Council for Australia. Just quickly, what is that, the Community Council for Australia?
It's a new umbrella organisation put together by about 25 not-for-profits.
What is the civil society or the third sector? Red wine involved, what is it and why is it important? Listen in.
Well, I think civil society is the parts of our lives and our community and our workplace that enable us to belong. I don't like the word connect. I'm not sure about engagement. I'm not sure about participation. But for me, belonging is really critical. And I'd like to think that in a civil society, government is about us. At the moment, I have a feel that it's very much government is them and we are us, and there's a very big divide. So for me, civil society is really the parts of our communities, and we belong to lots of different communities, that enable us to belong.
And why does that matter? Why is that important?
Well, you've been making lots of jokes about how people feel and the length of their life. I think if people have a sense of belonging, some sense that what they do is valuable and that they're part of something, then the capacity to not only be productive but to live well is greatly enhanced. If we could do one thing tomorrow, if we could give people a sense of belonging, of their own value, of their own meaning, then our health, our well-being, our productivity would all increase significantly.
I recommend you score, okay, because you've got to remember 6 before you vote. A score out of 10 on a little sheet. I think that was pretty good. Give him the clap of encouragement. Allison Peters, NCOSS. What is civil society? Why is it important?
Civil society to me is people together for better lives. Now, I want to make a few points about that. Better lives can mean lots of different things, and I think we get too caught up in assuming we all think we get to a better life by doing the same things, and I think that's a little problematic, but to me that's largely what it's about. I don't see it as being the same as the third sector. I'll stand up now and say I don't like the term third sector.
What do you think it means, and why don't you like it, and why is it different?
Well, sector is actually, to me, a divisive term. It divides us from other bits. I understand that, and I'm probably going to upset most of the people in the room who do this for a living, but it seems to me it's a definition so that people can study us. And while I think it's important we understand who we are and how we are, as someone who works for a social justice organisation, I'm not comfortable about being placed in a sector necessarily, let alone the third one. However, having said that, it is infinitely better than being not for profit or non-government or many other terms. I just struggle a little with the language. I've just got to admit.
Why is civil society, as you've defined it, important?
Because it comes back to people, and I think taking on what David said as well, it is about a sense of belonging. People like to be part of groups, and I think civil society is about how we, without the construct of market or indeed perhaps even government, which is about regulation, work together to improve their lives, whatever that might mean for them and the groups that they're working with.
Thank you so much. Would you give her a clap? And pop your score down for voting purposes. I'm going to come to David Thompson from Jobs Australia next, because did you notice he had an involuntary clap while Alison was speaking? Love an involuntary clap. Oh, you've got one.
Yes, I clapped out of turn because I'm a big fan. I completely eschew the use of the term third sector. We're the first sector, actually, if you want to put it properly.
Yes. Close to your mouth.
We're not non-profit. We're not non-government. I actually am a big fan of the use of the term civil society. And what I think civil society encompasses is a whole array of endeavour which is conducted by citizens. It ranges from tiny, tiny, tiny things in local communities to some very large institutions, but they all have one thing in common. They do things together for the common good. David talked about belonging. I think that's part of it, but I think the dimensions of it are much bigger than that. The Productivity Commission said our economic contribution in Australia is bigger than that of the retail sector. It also said we've got a long way to go in terms of demonstrating our impact in a whole variety of other ways, which I suspect will be a journey that will go on forever.
So I want you to tell the Year 12 student here why it matters, why they should commit their future studies and work to this world.
Because it's a part
Close to your mouth.
It's part of the a part of the world which I think is really rather remarkable when one reflects about it, where in Australia we've got many millions of citizens engaged in hundreds of thousands of organisations doing things for the common good, not for personal monetary gain, but because they want to contribute to the common good. Okay. And I think it's a really important part of the glue and fabric of our community and our society.
Thank you so much. Would you give David a round of applause and knock your score down? I will obsessively tell you to put it close to your mouth, partly because I always do, the entire world is hearing impaired, but also because it's being recorded for YouTube, and you know, unless you've got good quality sound, people will just flick onto something else, and it possibly won't be about civil society. Now, Jon Fitzgerald, the man with the core, Surf Lifesaving Australia. What is civil society and why does it matter?
I suppose my view is not so much the clothes that wears when we walk around and see it out there, but it's more by what it allows. And really it's a society that allows individuals to follow their passion into action. And I suppose coming from a volunteer base, I see that as absolutely critical. What does it do? Yes, it builds and it supports communities, but really enables community members to live the values in their lives through action, and it makes it possible for individuals to commit to those values in community action. And it becomes an agent of and for inclusion in our communities. And in that sense, really, it's the habits of the heart and that profound act of democracy.
I just thought they were stopping us drowning.
We don't want to get involved in drowning in all the verbiage.
No, but it's just so interesting. It's about values and belonging and connection. Very, very interesting. Would you please give him a round of applause? And please note down your score. You have 2 more people. We'll come to our friend Amanda from Union New South Wales. What would you like to say?
Well, to me, civil society is about organisations and independent organisations organised in collective action. So where people come together to participate in public life. And so in a sense, I guess I'm trying to be simple about it in that I don't think there's anything particularly complicated about the idea that lots of people seek to participate in organisations. I think it's also true to say that civil society at the moment is not particularly strong. Our organisations often struggle and aren't particularly strong, and a lot of the problems that we're facing in terms of vacant politics and harsh market are partly a product of the fact that we've got those weaknesses in our organisations and weaknesses in civil society.
And so why does a strong civil society really matter?
Well, it's the space where people's values and beliefs become projected into the world and become realised. That's the space where people can be who they want to be.
Give me an example that illustrates that.
Well, I mean, I just think of some of those remarkable days of public action. Like I think in 2003, even though the results of the action were not what we wanted, 500,000 people gathered in the city of Sydney to protest the war in Iraq. And people came out, 500,000 people, the largest demonstration in Australia's history. People came out because they thought that they could have their voices heard. Now, it may have not changed our government at the time, but it certainly influenced the United Nations, and it saw it, and I think it led to the fact that people like Barack Obama pulling the troops out, and people had their voices heard. So there's a sense of dignity that you actually get to determine how the world works through action in civil society.
Thank you so much. Amanda Tattersall, would you please? And pop a score down. And our final person before our vote is the Reverend Eleni Poulos from the Uniting Church.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to use a word that's already been indicated as a little bit problematic, that it is actually about connection for me, that it's about people connected by interest, by need, by vision and values, and most importantly by a story or narrative. I think it is a way that we organise ourselves as a community, and I'm not much on the term the third sector either. But
why not?
I think for all the reasons that have been talked about so far, but mainly because it actually imposes on civil society organisations an identity that I don't think exists, and I'm not sure whether it should exist. Two other things that I want to say. In relation to the usefulness of the term the third sector, I think civil society organisations are organisations that are not driven by political motives, so not driven by sort of a power motive, and they're not driven by the profit motive. So, you know, they're actually driven by the development of community and good communities, healthy communities. The other thing that I want to say is that I think it's about time that we reclaimed this idea that civil society organisations are there to actually promote the needs of small groups of people. I think one of the reasons that we're so weak these days is because the Howard government in particular did a very good job demeaning civil society by saying that only stood for minorities. Well, I think that's a fabulous thing, and I think that's one of the really important and crucial hearts of civil society, that you actually have organisations that work to deliver the kind of dignity that Amanda talked about for special interest groups. It's okay to be a special interest group, and the health of our community as a whole, I think, is, you know, you can measure that by how well people with special needs and special interests are looked after and cared for.
Eleni Poulos, could you give her a round of applause? I want you to jot down a score just before we go to the vote, because this is about values and community participation. Who in the audience would like to enter the competition with your definition of civil society? Who'd like to have a go? You're in for the red one. I just said one example from the audience. What is civil society? Why is it important? Who'd like to go for it? Guys, can you come down the front? It's being filmed, and it looks better if there's a decent crowd. Trust me, it's good for the sector or the society if you do it. Come on down. Come on, be my friends. No, down in this front row on the other side of that. And also, there is a chance of a lucky door prize because you can flip up your lid. Come on, guys, be responsive. Down you come. Thank you. Quick, come out the front quickly and we'll meet you. Oh, no, you can stay there if you like. I just got it. No, you need to stand. I'm sorry, I'll hold your iPad. Oh, lucky girl. Which sector are you from? Can you hold that? It's all got to be down there. What's your name and where you're from? I'll hold it.
Madeline Savitt, dual citizen of the US and Australia. I think that one of the things, the components that missing, I would take a composite of all of those definitions as being the glue of society, but I think for me the time frame is a longer time frame. It's not profit driven, it's driven for long-term profit, meaning what makes a society stronger, healthier, wealthier for the long term as opposed to the short term.
So it's can you turn that into a definition, your glue and your connections? What is civil society?
It's a society that the maximum percentage of individuals are self-actualized, who are living what they believe, who are pulling together as a society and with a vision for the long term, not short term.
Thank you very much. Would you give her a clap and a score? And very, very good camera technique. Thank you. I admire your people. That was great. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is now the time for the vote. It's going to be done by the clapometer. Do you wish to vote for David Crosby's definition for the bottle of red wine? This is competition policy in action. It's brutal. Do you wish to vote for Amanda Tattersall, mother of only 4 days? Watch me to see if I'm fair, but I felt that was roughly the same. I'm actually trying to be fair. David Thompson. Eleni Poulos. Allison Peters. Man with a core from Surf Lifesaving. And our beautiful friend with camera technique and the glue. It's extremely hard, but it's really hard. It's almost a neck and neck between Eleni, I'm so sorry, Jon, and our friend in the audience. I'm sure the panel won't mind if, given I think we've had a heat, we've had a tie, that I give it to the member of the audience for the encouragement of participation. Thank you. Don't wait, she doesn't drink, that's good, because that's a $100 book voucher from the Co-op bookshop, and they've donated it to us. So thank you very, very much. A round of applause, please. Look, guys, if I could just have the microphone back, please, to David at the end. And I hope that was really just a bit of fun to get the initial definitions onto the table. But I thought it was a very, very interesting focus, because for a number of the definitions, when it's about values and social connection and social good, could people in for-profit organisations be part of civil society? What's your thoughts on that, David?
Well, they need to be, and I think it was Porus and someone else who wrote a famous book called Built to Last, and Built to Last showed that organisations that performed particularly well, major companies, tended to focus on their mission rather than making money. And I think any for-profit organisation that seeks to do well needs to have some set of values and mission that inform them rather than being about making money. And it only works if that's enacted, and that is often best enacted through partnerships and collaborations with organisations who share those values and that mission. And I think increasingly in our community, businesses are recognising that it's about their mission, and I don't think we in our sector, or whatever we're calling ourselves, have actually been very good at linking in to those values and those missions and using them to strengthen our communities.
Just before I go further, just to be absolutely clear, so in your vision of civil society, coalitions with the private sector are still part of civil society?
Oh, very much so.
I'll just pause you there. Amanda,
can I say one other thing? In many ways, one of the strongest parts of community for many people now is their workplace. And I think any workplace that doesn't seek to enact values is not going to have a productive workforce, and it's not going to retain its workforce. I think the studies out of the UK in the last 12 months show that non-engagement in work is costing £69 billion a year. And non-engagement is about not identifying with or feeling as though you're valued within your workplace.
Just before I come back to you, David, Amanda, do you see the if you could keep your microphone, thank you. Do you see the profit sector as part of civil society?
Not particularly, but that doesn't mean you can't build alliances between the market sector and the civil society sector. I like to think of civil society as being about independent organisations that have a distinctive set of values and practices that are different from the market. And while many people who obviously participate in the market also participate in civil society, such as workers and employers, I do think that when they're acting in civil society, whether they're as members of a faith-based organisation or members of a union, project and are capable of a different kind of action that is worth understanding as discrete.
So when you talk about independent, you mean both independent from government and independent from business?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Again, we're not seeking to resolve anything. We're at the beginning of a conference and we're trying to stir up discussion. David Crosby, just explain what Community Council for Australia is that you head up.
Well, it's very new, so I like to explain things by their actions, and frankly, the Community Council for Australia hasn't done a lot of actions yet. The Community Council for Australia is a group of not-for-profits that have come together and put their own money on the table to establish a kind of umbrella organisation. And I think it's born of the frustration that so many things are written and talked about, and we have so many sets of words and policies that simply aren't enacted for our sector. So, you know, we have a national compact, we have policy statements, we have the Productivity Commission recommendations, many of which have been endorsed, but we don't see that translated into real action. And it actually, you know, for me, it's a bit ephemeral. It's a bit like clouds that float across the sky and cast no shadows and have no rain, and, you know, you wonder what those sets of words mean. And I think that frustration that there is theoretically a commitment, but in practice there's a massive gap between the rhetoric and what happens in community organisations around Australia. I think that's led to a frustration that led to forming a new organisation.
I'll just pause you there, and in a moment I'm going to get just a snapshot of what we're referring to with the Productivity Commission and also with the Compact. So if you're not sure what they are, just hold on, we'll come to it in a second. But one of the issues the organisers have asked us to get your views on, and if I could get just slightly more concise answers just to share the time, is do we need a unified voice, a unified identity as civil society, and particularly a public voice that is readily identifiable? And why I ask you this is that you tell us the Community Council for Australia is new, but I know David, sitting here, is a chair of the National Roundtable of Non-Profit Organisations. He's also a director with the Australian Council of Social Service, another national peak body. There's the Community 21, which is another organisation to provide a voice. Is it a strength or a weakness that there are a number of organisations seeking to speak for civil society?
I've just come from the Mental Health Council of Australia as the CEO there, and you know, one of the great things that's happened in terms of getting mental health on the agenda, which it is now, is that there were many voices raised, and the idea that it relied on one peak body or one umbrella organisation to achieve that is I think very linear and narrow thinking. I've always encouraged there to be as many voices as possible. The only danger with that is if they're contradictory. For as long as the voices being raised have a sense that they're, you know, they can sing different melodies, but you'd hope that at various times they come together in harmony. And you want different voices. It's very, if everyone's saying the same note, it's pretty boring. So I encourage as many organisations as possible to be advocates in the space around the third sector. And I think the more likely we are to be effective, because I actually think the common ground, the things that David and I and many other people would argue for, are actually, you know, almost identical. There may be little bits around the edges, but you know, 98.8% of them would be exactly the same kinds of things.
Just before I go on, is there anyone on the panel or in the audience who strongly disagrees with that, who thinks a united national identity and public voice for civil society is necessary for you to have the kind of influence on public policy and the lives of disadvantaged people that you wish to have? Yes, thank you. Amanda.
So I'm not going to advocate for a united national voice, but I do think one of the dysfunctions in civil society at the moment is a lack of effective reciprocal relationships between our organisations. Now, that doesn't mean people forcing themselves to work together on issues where they don't have mutual self-interest or any disagreement that you can't have short-term coalitions and short-term collaboration. But I do think one of the things that is not working with civil society is that we tend to stick in silos, that we tend to not be very well connected, that we don't actually know people outside of our comfort zone particularly much, that unions, community organisations, faith-based organisations, different organisations tend to not be very well connected. And actually making those connections work is a long-term intentional project that has to be nurtured, and I don't think that we nurture that very well. So any program, so while I don't think we need one national institution that can possibly claim to speak for the diversity of civil society, I do think we need a intentional mechanism that sees us connect more actively with people across difference.
I want you to, so who said here? Okay, thank you. Do you want to just introduce yourself? We'll just let the camera whiz around. Do you mind just standing, Jenny, please? It's for the camera. Just introduce yourself. I'll hold it. I'll hold it.
I'm trying to keep my mouth shut. Not very good at that. I think...
just who you are and where you're from.
I'm Jenny Onyx. I'm here at UTS. I'm co-director of the Centre for Cosmopolitan Civil Societies.
So why did you yell out here to Amanda's remarks?
Because I agree with that we need many voices and we are diverse. But we have been so diverse and so locked into our own silos that we're not talking to each other. So that's why we've got this panel from, I mean, probably most of us in this room would not have thought off the top of their head that there was anything in common between these people. I mean, what's surf lifesaving got to do with the churches, got to do with the unions, got to do with you know, mental health, etc., etc. But we all belong to this big umbrella, which is civil society. And if we don't speak out as such and see ourselves, identify ourselves as such, our voice is weakened and our influence in public policy and everything is weakened.
So I'll ask you this, just a quick answer. Is it a problem that there are a range of national bodies representing clusters of civil society, cluster of not-for-profit agencies trying to make progressive change in our society? Is it a problem that there are a number of voices and a number of organisations with different names, or not?
Yes and no. It's not a problem if they talk to each other. It is a problem if they don't. And Amanda pointed out that's our weakness. We don't, and we must.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else? Yes, thank you. A round of applause. Is there anyone else in the audience who has a passionate view on this? Please take this opportunity. The reason I'm holding the mic is partly for volume purposes, partly for total control, and also so that you remember to introduce yourself, because a much larger audience than is here today will watch this via YouTube. Can you just introduce yourself?
Yes, my name's Pat Webster. I'm from New Zealand, and I was formerly the director of the International Development Umbrella Organisation there. And I've been involved in a lot of discussion about this. I don't think that there can be one voice for civil society. In fact, I think what the people on the panel have in common is that they're members of non-government organisations which help to coordinate civil society efforts. And in the end, that's what they've got in common, is that they're non-government organisations and their role is facilitative. And so the voice that they have only is for non-government organisations, but they can be a very powerful force in actually helping people's voices to be heard, which is what I think the role is. And if you take it that way, you could get something that was more coordinated at the centre, I think.
What do you do in New Zealand?
At the moment, I'm doing a PhD.
But I meant more, what does civil society do in New Zealand? Do you have a unified...
We struggled very hard over this one, and we had a great deal of effort to try and bring it together. But because I think there is it's very difficult to get to the point where you understand what an organisation at the centre does, we didn't actually get there.
Does it matter that most ordinary people don't know the word civil society? It has no meaning to them whatsoever?
I don't think so. I think it's important that the organisations working in the field understand what they are and what their role is.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. There was someone else. Yes. So do you mind introducing yourself?
I'll hold it. Thank you. I'm Robbie Lord from Darwin. I am the chair of the Nightcliff Uniting Church in Darwin, but I'm here to talk about my PhD work in reforming mental health and disability support. But in my role with Elenie's mob, we have been involved in the asylum seeker support process, and I just want to answer David's warm, fuzzy feeling for the corporate sector with this scenario. We've had a lot of meetings to support asylum seekers in Darwin. So people come from all the church organisations and other community groups, the third sector, and we're all wanting to volunteer to help the asylum seekers, the parents, their children, and so on. And so Serco, the company that's being paid a hell of a lot of money by the federal government to do what we don't talk about, which is give these people a humane experience of being in this country, they say, thank you very much, guys, for offering all that voluntary support and doing teaching and language and bringing books for all these kids, which we don't do, but we get paid a shitload of money to hold these people in, confinement.
So what's your fundamental point, just in a nutshell?
Just saying that we do need a voice that is strong enough to say, can someone hear that a meeting of 150 people gets together to provide support for people who need support, but if you get 5 or 6 rednecks get together and complain about the fact that we're supporting boat people, they'll get more coverage than the 150 from the community who genuinely want to do something from the heart.
Okay, thank you very much. Would you give our audience participators a round of applause? David, could you just give the microphone to Amanda for a second, please? You remember Amanda Tattersall from Unions New South Wales just talked passionately about coalitions. Just tell us what the Sydney Alliance is, because if I could just ask you, the message I'm hearing so far is it doesn't matter if there are diverse groupings and organisations speaking for civil society. What matters is that you all talk to each other so that the choir, which may have some melodic variation, still fundamentally is on the same song sheet. Is that the metaphor we're dealing with? Is Sydney Alliance an attempt at some form of bridge building across differences?
Yes, it is. So the Sydney Alliance has been around for a couple of years. It's a broad-based coalition of religious organisations, unions and community organisations, and it's using the principles and practices of community organising that have been quite successful internationally at this project of rebuilding civil society. What we seek to do is to firstly cultivate stronger relationships between some of the larger institutions in Sydney before we then seek to work in the public arena. So we've been battling away, running training and community organising, building relationships between different organisations for 3 years now. Not sent out a press release, it's not about getting any media. It's about cultivating stronger relationships and trust. So we've got 28 organisations in the Alliance, the Archdiocese of the Catholic Church, the Jewish Board of Deputies, 9 unions, Western Sydney Community Forum, Migrant Metro Resource Council, the Arab Council of New South Wales, lots and lots and lots of very different organisations, the Muslim Women's Association, sort of organisations that don't often sit down together, could have things that they disagree on. We're okay with that. What people are coming together about is to try and cultivate relationships of trust, be able to work on issues that they have in common, and in particular to revitalise their organisations, increase volunteer participation, and then be able to make a better city.
Just very, very briefly, how will you measure success over 3 or 4 years? What results will you look for and say this was worth all the meetings?
Impact. Whether we actually change the direction of public policy on particular issues. So we're running listening campaigns at the moment within our organisations. About 2,000 people will participate in those listening campaigns over the next 6 months. Well, they'll surface some issues that are common across organisations, and then we'll turn that into an agenda for public action that we launch in September next year. Though we'll cut those issues to be quite specific. We're not about coming up with a lofty program of niceness. It's about coming up with specific ideas that we then seek to negotiate with market and government leaders to implement.
Guys, my apologies when I have to interrupt, but obviously I've got to share the time. We have about 30 minutes left. I'm going to come to Jon Fitzgerald, our former Director of Development, Surf Lifesaving Australia. What's happening inside your brain? What are you thinking about right now as you listen?
Right now, I'm trying to, shall I say, interpret and translate unified voice, and I'm translating it more in terms of unified presence, because if there's a unified presence, and that's what we've been talking about, coalitions or whatever, then that unified presence actually amplifies the voices that need to be heard when they need to be heard. So it's not a structural solidification, it's not unified equals solidification in the structural sense, but it's that sense of presence.
Give me an example of effective presence, so I know what you mean.
Our organisation, I'll use SURF, 100 years in this country, seemed to be an icon, but we couldn't actually articulate why we're iconic. What was it? And so we've done some mining of our values, and we actually started to bring to surface some of the values that seem to be shared across the Australian community. And these values now are now part of who we are and what we do. And we've understood that we need to actually understand who we are before we, so we know who we are to be able to do the things we need to do. And so there's a strong values base. Came out of, you recall, the Cronulla riots in 2005, where in fact it was young Australia, mainly white Australia, who are actually rioting in that sense. And as an organisation, we've been saying for at least another 8-9 years before that, we are white, monocultural, Anglo-Celtic based, and up until 1980 male dominated. If we're going to stay that way throughout the rest of our history, we will become irrelevant in Australian society. We need to move and challenge who we are and what we do. But we actually went back and mined that and said, well, and a 45-year-old white Anglo member who'd been in the organisation 40 years said, "John, what's in that for me?" And I said, "What are the things that kept you in the organisation?" I was valued. People wanted to involve me. I felt I belonged. What's different in terms of that with anyone else coming into the organisation? And he said, "Nothing." I said, "Well, why don't we extend that to everyone?" I look around here, I see form in terms of our bodies, yes, but I know behind that is the living being, you know, the organism.
Just very, very briefly, John, what steps have you taken to change in the light of Cronulla?
We've actually had to relook at who we are, how we articulate ourselves. That bronze Aussie buff image, yes, is not the image that people want to see. Uniforms. Because
I've seen media images soon after that of Muslim women in sort of all-in-one cozies with the little burkini, thank you, with the you know, yellow and red hat on, and they were powerful media images of a different message. Was that something SURF, as you call it, worked on?
Yes, but it's one of those things I think we all come together with. An organisation with 5 generations from 5 years of age to 95 years of age who go on the beach in a similar get-up, so there's no protocol in terms of socio-economic background, or and we get a 5-year-old talking to a 95-year-old, calling them by first names, sharing a joke. Age protocols don't exist, so you start to cut away those things. And as an organisation, we hadn't really intellectualised that and articulated that to ourselves for a start, and then to the community.
John, as I say, keep the mic please. One of the strong messages I've heard is the importance of coalition and communicating across silos. In your current journey in Surf Lifesaving Australia as you move forward, are you in coalition with other members of civil society?
We have 307 separate clubs, separate legal entities, who, if they don't believe we're going the right way, will say, "Sorry, we're out of here." So internal in our organisation, we're very diversified, but also, I suppose, working with a whole range of other organisations outside of that to actually bring that in, talking to rural fire services who say, "John, we appreciate the values base you bring. We want to actually mine and explore our values base. Can you come and help us?"
One of the questions we've got is this: should there be a national unified voice? Is there a merit in Surf Lifesaving Australia moving beyond, say, the 20 additional civil society agencies you historically have connections with to meet some of the people from the Sydney Alliance? Do you know what I'm saying? Or does it not matter? Can people in civil society work more in a sense with like-minded organisations involved in common purpose? How much connection is necessary?
I think the connection lives in individual people. I mean, I work in a situation, I live in another situation, I'm involved in a whole range of areas, but really there's one me, and it sits in here. And they are coalitions. And I suppose I come from a more individual development side of the issue of civil society, not the structural side. Yeah. So.
And you would speak, of course, for very large numbers of volunteers who would feel similarly. Can I just ask you this? I know from speaking to John earlier that he's very passionate about volunteers and the social capital involved in volunteers, the benefit to the whole community, and the potential impact on society of the action of volunteers. But you feel there's a real tension between the history and culture of volunteers and the focus on social enterprise. Can you explain what social enterprise is and what some of the issues are that you're working through?
I think the model of social enterprise is really encouraging organisations like Surf Lifesaving Australia to become more business orientated and start working in the market economy. And one of the issues that tends to have, particularly an organisation of 153,000 members, of which 50% are under the age of 18, where we need that professionalism, we tend to think we go to professional staff to do this, and volunteers, and the Productivity Commission makes this very, very clear, that the effectiveness in volunteer organisation is more the passion, the drive, the commitment, the process that comes out of that. And so my concern is, if we professionalise in terms of staff a lot of the functions, then we'll actually start eroding the volunteer base, and our organisation is one that has been increasing against the tide with a number of volunteers. So that blend is a best of both. It's and, not or.
Look, thank you so much. Could I go to Eleni now, please? Reverend Eleni Poulos is National Director of Uniting Justice Australia with the Uniting Church. Your passion is coalitions, but you're focusing on respect and relationships. How does that fit into this vision for the future of civil society?
I think the Sydney Alliance model is a really good example of the sorts of things that I'm interested in. But let me give you another example. Part of my role in the Uniting Church is to build our relationships across civil society and to identify groups and organisations where we may not share the whole story, but where we share common values and can work together for particular changes to public policy. Now, the Uniting Church is the only church in Australia to have an official position in support of the development of a Human Rights Act for Australia. And the reason that we've gone that way is because we've seen that that government policy in Australia without legislative protection for human rights as exists in other countries can often ride roughshod over the human rights of many different groups of people. You think of Indigenous Australians and asylum seekers, refugees in the community, sort of thing. Now, the Uniting Church was a founding member of something called the Australian Human Rights Group, which was a group of between 60 and 70 organisations that came together to support two movements that were designed to lead to public policy change. One, that to encourage the government to hold a national, open, public, huge, big, transparent human rights consultation, which happened. And the second one was to support the development of a Human Rights Act for Australia. Now, across the breadth of those organisations, there were lots of detail around what a Human Rights Act might include, how it might be implemented, where its focus might be, where all of those organisations had something different and unique to bring to the table. But what we managed to do was identify a common goal, and we worked together to pull off what was the largest number of public submissions to a federal consultation. So there are over 35,000 submissions made to the human rights consultation, the one that Frank Brennan chaired. That's a major achievement. Now, the problem that we've got is how does government respond to that? Well, when Amanda's already spoken about the protests against Iraq, there was also the walk across the bridge for reconciliation, and then there was, I think, the 2006 walk against warming, which was massive. So you got those three massive civil society public events, protests, demonstration. You've got a human rights consultation, 35,000 submissions, 90% of which were in support of a Human Rights Act. And in all of those cases, they've gone nowhere. Now, that's a big concern for me, and that's an indication of what we've been talking about in terms of the softness, if you like, of civil society. One of the things, can I just digress a little bit, because I just wanted to make this point. It's been raised a number of times. One of the things that concerns me is, particularly at a federal level, is the federal government's enthusiasm for dealing with peak bodies. Yes. Only with peak bodies, because they're looking for a quick, easy answer and say if we can get one peak body, at the table, then we'll have consulted with civil society. And I think peak bodies are really important, and they have very significant roles to play. But what we have to do within civil society organisations is actually help to shape a political culture and a public culture that says we're more interested in the long term, and to get the long term right, it actually takes time, it takes thought, it takes care, and that's not going to be solved by sitting across a table from one peak body.
I'll come in one second to you, Alison, but Eleni, let me just stay with you. You've named some major gatherings of action of civil society, and you've said, and we didn't make the change we wanted. There's a part of what I want to do now is start moving towards the future, and I know I must come to David and Alison, and I will. But as we look I'll come to you one sec. As we look forward to the future, What's got to change? So if we were having this conference in 2020, we would be able to list compelling examples of results achieved in the community as the result of the action of civil society. What's got to change? Just very briefly, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think the first thing that has to change is the way that government relates to civil society organisations, and the only way that they're going to change the way that they relate is if civil society actually changes the way that it operates, and it needs to operate on a sort of a coalition basis, working together where we can, like the Sydney Alliance, where we build those relationships first, and then we come together around things where we share a desire for a major change of public policy, and then behind closed doors, you know, let's work out our differences.
So in a nutshell, in 2020 I would be seeing a lot more unified public speaking by people identified as civil society. Did you want to comment on this particular issue? You keep the mic, Eleni. Alison, what do you want to say?
I was actually just going to talk about NCOSS, believe it or not. NCOSS is 75 years old, and this year, August the 8th to be precise, we're very happy to have reached 75. But NCOSS came into being because organisations, let's just call them charities because that's what they were in those days, coming out of the Great Depression wanted to do two things. They wanted to have a clearer voice in engaging with government about social policy, but they also wanted to better coordinate their own efforts. And I think the point Eleni makes about peaks is important. It is about a voice to government, but it's a voice of the constituent organisations who've had that conversation first, that they themselves have worked out what they have in common rather than constantly, as we do, focus on why we can't do stuff. What are our points of difference? So I just wanted to reiterate in some ways, in a slightly different way, given that we're a peak body, saying we do have a role, but part of the peak's role is not just about being a single voice to government, it's about bringing together its constituent parts so that we can actually have the conversation ourselves first.
If you could give the mic to David, but I'm going to ask Alison one more question. I guess I want to imagine a Year 12 student in here, and we've got to convince them it's worth doing research in this area, committing some of their career energy to this area, because you can really make a difference here. So far, goodness me, you have these great big rallies and all these consultations, doesn't make any bloody difference. You're all really different. Like, why should I get involved and commit the next 10 years of my life to making this better?
Oh dear. As a veteran of the trade union movement, but now also working in a slightly different part of the civil society, it's important because we actually believe the world can be a better place. Yeah. And that's, to me, a fundamental part about being human. And if we lose that, we lose everything. And that's why it's important. And it's important to recognise that there is no one way, and our communities and our democracy is stronger by having a discussion about these issues and proceeding once we've had that discussion, rather than proceeding and then having the discussion.
And what are one or two key lessons we can learn from 75 years of experience with the New South Wales Council of Social Service that will help us do it better in the next 10? What are the two key lessons for getting results that you've learned?
Well, it's quite remarkable. I mean, certainly we've done some very big and been engaged in very big campaigns as well, and we tend to focus on where we don't win. And the reality is we actually win a great deal. The fact that we're still here 75 years later, and indeed we can actually trace most of the 30 or so organisations, they're still here too. They might be somewhat different looking, but they're still here, so that's important. We do have that longevity, and so we are also able to engage because we also have that history and we do know what works. But I also think some key points are NCOSS has always been strong about engaging in discussion, and the other causes, ACOSS as well, about getting that discussion together. And I think too, working on what we have in common and working on that rather than necessarily focusing on why we can't do particular things.
But I still hear a focus on survival and process, not results. I'm just being really brutal. That wouldn't keep me in year 12. I'm off to the private sector.
Well, can I be frank? We actually have a real problem in here, because an awful lot of our best and brightest are going off to do other things, and it's a really hard one. Yeah. However, I do think it's amazing, because when we look at, for example, voluntary work and the work of volunteers, Australia has a very high rate of participation, whether it be through sports, whether it be through being on boards of management of the sort of organisation I work for example, whether it be a union delegate in a workplace. There are very high levels of working as volunteers, and I think that's a good base to start off. But I do worry that the market economy, and I know that Eleni has spoken a little bit about this, as have some of the other speakers, the market economy is actually taking our best and brightest, and we have to really understand how we can do better ourselves at that.
Thank you. Just before I come to David, I've got involuntary body movements from you. Just tell us, what are you thinking?
I don't know what television mannerism is, as you referred to, but I know when I'm being upstaged. Anyway, it's not going to happen from government. I had a searingly memorable conversation with a geologist who's a mining executive, and he said to me, government does not have power. If you want to get power, you've got to engage the private sector. It's being done elsewhere in the world. This man works all over the world. There is the willingness, and you have to tap into it. There are already businesses taking the lead in sustainability. They know that it's profitable for the long term for them, and with all of these efforts on behalf of people, etc., you've got to engage the private sector. That's where the power is, and you must have the media spotlight.
So you want, so in a nutshell, you're saying, what are you saying to these people, in a nutshell, are the action points over the next 10 years?
To reach out to the private sector, big companies. It's already being done elsewhere. That's where the money is. That's where the power is. Government will follow. I'm sorry, I'm just going to come to this gentleman first. And what are you thinking?
Well, I think the reason that people choose to workplaces is about values, fundamentally. And I think it's about belonging and engagement and achieving things and feeling as though you're valued. And I think that's what the sector offers above many of its competitors.
And what do you think of the suggestion, that you should engage with the private sector that's been so passionately put? Your view?
Well, I think increasingly the private sector is recognising that the number one issue that keeps private sector CEOs awake at night, according to the surveys, is retaining quality staff. And the number one reason that people stay in workplaces is that they feel valued. So, you put those two together, and corporates are having to think about the role of their own communities and how that relates to people's lives.
So do you think non-profit agencies are intrinsically better at values than the private sector? Would you argue that?
Yeah, I would. I think non-profits come together around the values. I think businesses come together around a whole set of values, part of which is making money and producing value for shareholders, a whole range of other factors. I think not-for-profits are focused very much on a core set of values around collective interest.
Okay, thank you. Let me introduce into the conversation David Thompson from Jobs Australia. You want to start a non-profit pride movement. Can you tell me what you mean? And does it help us with this question of the next 10 years and what we should be focusing on?
I think we have
Close to your mouth, David.
We have a real problem of identity. There's a lot of organisations, civil society organisations, I'm not going to use those other terms, that have a lot of interaction with government. And a lot of that, and government tends to try to remake those organisations in its own image as, in effect, mini bureaucracies.
Could I just ask you, because the National Compact Working Together was published by the current federal government recently this year, and there's a list of priorities for action about civil society. Is this good that this is happening with our federal government, or do you see it as pressure to become a certain sort of sector for the purposes of government?
Well, I'll go straight to the UK, where they have a much, much more robust, compact and set of governance arrangements for it, and it's not working. Ours is, I think, in its current form, well, I said to, it was actually the former government, the Rudd government, not the Gillard government. A compact has got to be a lot more than just words. It needs to be concrete actions. If it's just words, I said to a senior figure in the Rudd government that it'd be a lot cheaper and better to go out to an op shop and buy a copy of Desiderata. It probably only cost about 20 cents, full of nice words, and it doesn't mean all that much.
So give me the sense of, do you think a compact with government is a useful idea? I want to focus in our last 10 minutes on priorities for the next couple of years. Is it a useful process with government, or is it a diversion from the kind of relationship building and coalition building that seems to have dominated our conversation so far?
I think if it were fair dinkum and it had a lot more teeth, it would be very useful. But it's got a long way to go.
So give me, what would it look like if it was fair dinkum and had teeth? Get specific.
Governments would undertake to provide for those where it's buying services from organisations in civil society, it would pay the full cost of them and undertake to do so. Where it's contracting with them, it would make sure those contracts are fair and balanced and workable from both parties' points of view. In my day job, I deal with members who sign contracts that the Whitlam Institute and PAC, the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, who did a study on, no commercial lawyer in Sydney would sign one because they're so lopsided, so one-sided, so unbalanced. So we've got a long way to go, but I think it's really important that it comes back to this question of identity and value. If you think about the fact that civil society in Australia is bigger in economic terms than the retail sector, it engages millions of citizens, and I'd say to the Year 12 student, yes, let's shut it down for a week and see what happens. Let's see what happens in our communities if we don't have civil society. I once met a Polish academic in the civil society space who was telling a story about their need to completely rebuild civil society after the demise of the communist state because the state ran everything. And I think one of the things, so getting back to my point, we need to have relationships with the private sector, but we don't need to be like the private sector.
Give us an example of either of an existing relationship with the private sector that shows us the way forward.
I think relationships where it's not a sort of poor begging second cousin trying to get some resources out of a private sector organisation, but one, as I said at a meeting of the CSI's Advisory Council last week, where the private sector's getting a benefit from learning about the complexity of managing and operating non-profit organisations on one hand, and giving a benefit in terms of their particular wisdom on something as well.
And are you able to give me a specific example? No. Has anyone on the panel got a specific example of civil society and private sector in partnership achieving benefits to the community, just to explore the issue raised by our audience member, Allison Peters?
Probably the best example is organisations like PILCH, the Public Interest Law Clearinghouse, where they broker between non-government organisations and private law firms to provide legal advice on a range of issues. There's a PILCH in Victoria and there's also a PILCH in New South Wales. So those sorts of connections, I think, are probably the best example of where you can work. Sometimes the issues are very small, and quite frankly, sometimes they are very, very large. So, but that's where you can bring them together, where you're relying on the strength and the expertise of both, rather than saying one model of working is the best way and we're tapping into that. It's not either or, it's both.
What I want...
Can I just comment on that?
Yes, thank you.
It's a really good example in the sense that government has, when it's tendering its legal contracts, requires that legal firms have to have a pro bono contribution. So, in a sense, it's a partnership, but it also involves government, because they've created a regulatory environment that actually stimulates and promotes law firms to commit to engaging at a pro bono level.
Can I just say, as someone who works all over the place in all the sectors, I've met a lot of young lawyers in major firms who are part of this project that's being discussed, Pilch. I was in Burke recently, a domestic violence prevention forum, an all Aboriginal audience and 2 young women from a major firm. So it also, I think, has the impact of deepening in a very visceral way an understanding in the corporate sector of what's happening. But guys, we've got just 5 minutes left. I want to hear from as many people as possible. I'm going to start in the audience. The single most important priority for action in the next couple of years. If we're to see, I'll come to someone else first if I may, so just as you've already spoken, if we're going to see civil society playing a powerful role to improve the lives of our citizens. Has anyone got any thoughts on what you see as the most critical issue? Just your name and where you're from, I'll lean over.
My name's Eleni Poulos. I'm a board director of a community centre. I'm also since last week now on the National Register for the Mental Health Consumer and Carers panel, and I'm also a carers representative for Carers New South Wales. I think the single most, and formerly I was a banker and in the private sector, and I've also worked for the World Bank, but I think the single biggest thing is that in 10 years' time, something like the Community Council for Australia should be listened to and have as much impact as the Business Council of Australia. So when the government wants to increase the mining tax, the Business Council and its members basically stopped that happening. And I mean, you know, that's an example where, you know, if the voice of the Community Council for Australia, you know, could actually, speak for civil society and the interests of us as human beings and as the glue.
Can I just ask you, from your diverse experience, 1 or 2 things that would make that happen, what you've just said? What would have to happen for Community Council for Australia to be as powerful a voice as the Business Council?
Well, I do feel that there has to be unified presence. So I suppose that's my opinion on that take. And I'm not so sure about, there should be dialogue and engagement with the business sector, but I don't think the waters should be muddied.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't think that, business should per se become part of the Community Council for Australia, for example.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Is there someone else in the audience who'd like to express a view? Just if you could just briefly introduce yourself.
I'm Bishia Wan. I'm from New Zealand. I'm head of an organisation dealing with change, loss and grief of children and young people, and I'm also a mental health commissioner in New Zealand. You know, if we look to the future, and I look around here and I look at myself, we're mediatrics and geriatrics, really. You know, if we're looking to the future, we have to have young people in this audience, not say, well, let's talk to the 12-year-old or the 13-year-old at the back. How are we going to engage young people? And we've got a great baby here. That's a baby who should be here in the future, 10, 20 years from now.
So give me the action. What's the action that's most important?
The action is that we should have more young people on our boards. We should have more young people represented, talking about their world. Shouldn't be talking about their future. They should be involved in it. And we don't actually engage at boards and CE levels at that environment. We have to do some succession planning.
Thank you. Can I just come and ask you who you are and what brought you here? Excuse me, if everyone could just breathe in for a second. What's your name and where are you from?
I'm Chris Roffey. I'm a researcher at UWS.
Do you mind me asking how old you are?
I'm 28.
28. Well, I'm going to call that young. Do you mind just standing up just so the camera can catch you? What do you see as the critical thing for us to do, those of us who care about civil society, for it to have a powerful voice?
I think it has to get much more assertive, not just at the peak body level, but actually in the small community organisations. And they're the organisations that I actually researched for my PhD. it's usually left up to the peak bodies, I've found, to argue the case and to actually give a day to a community organisation to think about these ideas and, you know, present alternative perspectives and argue, even with corporations or with peak bodies, about ideas. That's very liberating, I've found, and can actually be really positive in terms of getting them really excited about their work, I've found. So that's, I think, just reconnecting with the core focus.
Just one last question. Where does research fit into this? Because this is a research conference, and I'm going to get 2 quick remarks from members of our panel, and then I'll close because our time is up. But how can research contribute, in your view?
Well, I'm an action researcher, so I strongly disagree with the kind of research that just steps back and watches. I like research that actually engages with the community, gets them involved, actually lets them lead the way with research. So I think the community sector is, well, it has the capacity to do its own research. It doesn't need to be just academics to do that.
And what drew you to this world?
Just by chance, really. I was interested in sociology and human rights, and just by accident I fell into a community development kind of project, and I've kept going since then.
Yeah, that's what life's like. Thank you so much. Would you give both those participants a round of applause? Could I come to Eleni, please, if I may? Eleni from the Uniting Church. Just a very quick remark, because we're almost out of time. Where does research fit in? This is a research conference. How can it contribute?
I think for me, when we're talking about civil society, the plea that I would make to researchers is not to try and measure us, because I think that the value that civil society organisations bring to Australian society is not measured in a way that governments like things to be measured. Okay, it's a bit like the civil society version of. You know, we're going to assess how well we're doing in our education system by measuring how well kids do on a couple of tests. That's actually not what it's about. So I think in terms of, I think it's about methodology, and I think it's about pushing the boundaries of methodology so that we come to get good pictures of the value that civil society organisations bring to the community, but not in quantifiable ways.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, Alison, what would you say about the value and contribution of research?
Research is absolutely critical, and I think the point's been well made. The sector actually needs to do it ourselves. We're not very good at documenting our own impact. And the other thing too, partly, and I think it goes to the point Eleni made, we've got governments at the moment who want innovation and evidence, and you can't actually be innovative if you can't do anything until it's based on evidence. Never quite worked that one out. But it really is, we have to sometimes say, we are going to make mistakes. This is not a risk-free environment, but research as we go along at least documents what we're doing, and so we can learn from that.
Look, thank you. I'm going to give one very quick final word to David Crosby, the CEO of Community Council for Australia, because I want him to be as powerful as the Business Council, and also he's been in the job one day longer than that 4-day baby has been alive. So I thought we'd just close by saying, you know, what do you hope to achieve in the next 12 months as you listen to all these hopes and expectations?
Well, I think there's 2 things. The first is that I want what happens in civil society or in the third sector or not-for-profit sector or non-government sector, I want it to be valued and acknowledged much more than it is. And that starts with individual people and their contact together with their clients or their customers or whoever else we want to call them. You know, until we create information about that exchange and share that information, we will not be valued. And the second thing I'd like to see is that we increase accountability for the sets of words that governments and others use. I think too often governments can just say, well, you know, We want to build a stronger relationship with less red tape, and then they do one action and say, tick that box, we've done that. And I think we let them get away with that because we don't hold them accountable. And I think that applies to business as well. They can put up their fancy mission statements, but they're not actually held accountable for that. And I think, and it's another critical role for research and information, we need to actually hold people accountable for the words they use about this sector.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank our panel? Thank you. And I'll hand back over to our host.
Yes, and can we please thank Julie McCrossin for a wonderful... That's been a wonderful session and has raised all the issues and challenges that we're struggling with and that we will try and address through the course of this conference.